toe, 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 to stambe en bepring transcript gav bemsi afre fan ti. Bij uik the han te, bihi ich viet fan te, biefene, toe uit triafi, te ik ving hout vingja, toe hrad triaprem. To moment my mother-in-law pointed across the ballroom and told me to go stand with the catering staff, I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, at the diamond brooch on her lapel, at the glass of champagne she held like a scepter, and I thought, she has no idea. She has absolutely no idea that without my signature on a single document this morning, none of this happens tonight. Not the flowers, not the lighting, not the open bar she's already made good use of. Not one thing in this room exists without my company's approval. My name is Vivienne. And this was the night I stopped pretending I didn't matter. The venue was a restored estate in Westchester, the kind of place that gets written up in New York social diary and charges $12,000 just to walk through the front door. My husband's family had rented it for the evening to celebrate his parents' 40th wedding anniversary. 400 guests. A Michelin-starred chef brought in from the city, live music, past hors d'oeuvres, a custom cocktail named after my mother-in-law that she'd mentioned approximately 11 times since September. Every detail of the evening had been designed and executed by Ellison & Co. Event Management. That's my company. I founded it at 26. I've run it for 9 years. My in-laws hired us 6 months ago through our client services team. The initial inquiry came in while I was in Phoenix managing a corporate conference. My operations director, a woman named Zoe who has been with me since almost the beginning, handled the intake. She didn't connect the last name. Why would she? My professional name is Vivienne Ellison. My married name is Vivienne Ellison. My married name is Vivienne Calloway Marsh. My mother-in-law's name is Constance Calloway Marsh. By the time I returned from Phoenix and looked at the client roster, the contract was signed. 50% deposit received. I could have told Zoe to call them. Could have issued a conflict of interest disclosure and referred them to another firm. I genuinely considered it, sitting at my desk with the contract on my screen, thinking about the 17 years I had spent in that family and what they had decided. Somewhere along the way that I was worth, I kept the contract. I assigned my best team. I made sure the event would be flawless, not to impress them, but because that's what my company does. We deliver what we promise. We don't allow personal circumstances to affect our professional standards. What I did not do was tell anyone in the Calloway Marsh family that I was the one running their party. That decision would have consequences I could not entirely predict. But let me back up, because to understand what happened that night in Westchester, you need to understand what the 17 years before it looked like. I met my husband at 23. He was the kind of man who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. Easy with strangers, quick to laugh, generous in ways that cost him something rather than nothing. I fell in love with him before I fully understood that loving him meant navigating constants. My mother-in-law is a woman who has never once said anything cruel directly. She is far too refined for that. Instead, what she does is adjust the temperature of a room so gradually that you don't realize you've gone cold until you're already shivering. The first time I met her was at Sunday dinner at their house in Greenwich, about 4 months into dating her son. She asked about my family. I told her my parents were both teachers, that I'd grown up in a small city in Ohio, that I'd gotten through college on scholarships and part-time work. She nodded through all of it with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite dismissal, but sat somewhere in between, the expression of a woman cataloguing a deficiency she intends to factor in. Over the years, the message never changed. Only the delivery method varied. There was the dinner party where she introduced me to her friends. As Harrison's wife, she works in events. The particular inflection on works in events, suggesting something seasonal and peripheral, the way you might describe someone who assists at a farmer's market on weekends. There was the holiday where she gave me a cookbook, a nice one actually, while she gave my sister-in-law, who was married to the eldest son and came from a family my mother-in-law had known for 2 generations, a piece of jewellery that had belonged to her grandmother. There were the conversations I wasn't included in, the decisions made about family holidays that assumed my schedule was either non-existent or irrelevant, the way she spoke to my husband about his career and achievements while I sat at the same table eating the same meal, somehow invisible. None of it was ever something you could point to and say, "There, that's the thing." It was accumulation, pattern, the architecture of being considered secondary. My husband, to his credit, saw more of it than I expected. We talked about it enough times that I stopped bringing it up, not because the conversations went badly, but because they didn't change anything. Constance was Constance. She had been this way his entire life, with everyone who didn't fit the precise shape of what she'd imagined her family would look like. He apologized for her regularly and genuinely, but apologies and action are different currencies. I stopped expecting action a long time ago. What I did instead was work. I had started my career at 22 at a small corporate events company in Manhattan, answering phones and confirming vendor contracts and doing whatever needed doing. Within 18 months, I'd been promoted into a planning role. Within 4 years, I was managing a portfolio of 30 annual accounts. I was good at it in a way that felt less like talent and more like necessity. I had grown up watching my parents solve problems with whatever was available, no margin for waste, and that instinct translated directly into event management, where the gap between what you'd planned and what actually happened was where most people fell apart. I didn't fall apart. I adapted. I found solutions. I stayed calm in ways that made clients trust me and made vendors work harder. At 26, I left to start my own firm with $40,000 in savings, a short list of clients who told me they'd follow me if I went out on my own, and a workspace I rented by the hour at a co-working office in Midtown. The first year was brutal in the specific way that first years are, too much work to do and not enough money to do it well, every crisis feeling catastrophic until it wasn't. But I was building something. I could feel it even when it scared me. By the time Harrison and I got married, I was 29 by then. Ellison & Co. had 7 employees and a reputation solid enough that we were being approached by clients rather than pitching them. I didn't talk about it much at family gatherings. I'd learned quickly that sharing professional news with the Callaway Marshes produced one of 2 reactions: polite disinterest from most of them, or a particular kind of reframing from Constance that made my accomplishments sound like modest contributions to a world she'd already fully mapped. Once, early in the marriage, I mentioned that we'd just been hired to produce a fundraising gala for a major New York hospital, a real event, the kind that gets covered in the Times. Constance listened, nodded, then turned to her oldest son to ask about a golf tournament he'd played in the previous weekend. The conversation about the tournament lasted 20 minutes. My mention of the hospital gala was the last thing I volunteered at a family dinner for several years. You learn to protect yourself, which isn't quite the same thing. The years passed, and my company grew. We had 18 employees by the time I was 32. We managed events for corporations, universities, non-profits, and private clients with the kind of budgets that made scope feel genuinely exciting. Our work was in publications my mother-in-law subscribed to. Our client list included names she dropped in conversation regularly without knowing we worked with them. She never asked about my work in a way that suggested she wanted an actual answer. The question, "How's business?" when she did ask it carried the same weight as "How are you?", a social lubricant, not a genuine inquiry. The correct response was fine, busy, good, and then she would move on. I gave her the correct response every time. My husband and I had built a good life, comfortable. A brownstone in Brooklyn, weekends upstate sometimes, dinners with friends who knew what I did and valued it. Within my industry, I had built a real reputation, the kind that takes years and consistent work to accumulate and can evaporate in a single badly managed event. I was careful with it. I treated every client's occasion as though the stakes were exactly as high to me as they were to them, because I had decided early on that was the only sustainable way to run a business. The Callaway Marsh anniversary inquiry came in on a Tuesday in March. I was in Phoenix, like I said, so he handled the intake. The contact was Constance's personal assistant, a young woman named Becca who had been with my mother-in-law for 2 years and was apparently not aware that Constance had a daughter-in-law who ran an event company, or if she was aware, didn't connect the company name. We are not listed under any version of Callaway Marsh. We are Ellison & Co. The gap was entirely plausible. By the time I got back to New York and read through the new client files, the scope had been set. A 40-year anniversary celebration for 200 to 400 guests at a Westchester venue, with a budget that told me everything I needed to know about what Constance Callaway Marsh considered appropriate for an occasion of this significance. The budget was very, very comfortable. I sat with it for 3 days before deciding to stay on the account. My reasoning was this: my team would execute a flawless event regardless of who the client was. That was not in question. The question was whether I could manage my personal situation well enough to ensure my professional standards weren't compromised, and the honest answer was yes, because I had been managing that personal situation for 17 years at this point. Compartmentalization was something I'd been doing my whole life. Also, and I didn't let myself think about this part too clearly, but it was there. I wanted to see how they behaved when they thought no one who mattered was watching, when they thought I was just the invisible wife present at the periphery. I wanted to see whether anything in the Callaway Marsh family had changed in the years I'd been telling myself it didn't matter whether it had. I told Zoe I'd handle the account personally. She raised an eyebrow. Owner-level involvement on a private event wasn't standard protocol, but she didn't push. She's worked with me long enough to understand when I'm making a decision rather than explaining one. The months between March and November were ordinary in the way that complex planning phases always are, full of details, calibrations, small crises managed before they became visible crises. I attended one planning call with Becca and gave notes through Zoe. I was never in a room with Constance during the planning process. She didn't know I was involved. I don't know whether Harrison suspected. I didn't tell him, but if he did, he said nothing. The night of the event, I arrived at the estate at 4 in the afternoon, 4 hours before guests. I walked every room, checked every setup, had a quiet conversation with the catering team lead about a timing adjustment I wanted to make to the appetizer service, confirmed the lighting cues with our AV coordinator, verified that the escort card display, something Constance had very specific feelings about, I'd learned through the planning notes, was exactly as she'd requested. Everything was right, it always is, by the time we finish. By 7 the guests had begun arriving and I had stepped back into what I privately think of as observer mode. I was dressed for the occasion, a dark green dress, understated, appropriate, but I had chosen it deliberately for its discretion. In a room full of women in statement jewellery and primary colours, I would register as background. That suited me. I watched the Callaway Marshes arrive. Constance entered in champagne-coloured silk that probably cost more than my first month's rent out of college. My father-in-law one step behind her, already looking like a man who was ready for this to be over, but had made his peace with a long night. My husband came in with his brothers and their wives, and I watched him scan the room for me, find me, and offer a small wave across the space. I waved back. He started toward me, then got intersected by a cousin and stayed where he was. The evening began to move. Cocktail hour with the past hors d'oeuvres my team had coordinated. They were exceptional. I tasted them at the trial run in October. The string quartet playing in the corner, the selection Zoe had finalized after 3 rounds of back and forth with Constance about whether something felt too modern. I circulated at the edges, spoke briefly with a few people I knew from my husband's world, kept my distance from Constance as I always did at family events, because proximity to Constance at social functions had historically produced outcomes that required emotional recovery time. I was standing near the bar, watching one of our servers navigate a tray through a cluster of guests, when my mother-in-law found me. She was with 2 women I didn't recognize, both approximately her age, both wearing the particular expression of women who have spent a lifetime sorting other people into categories that matter or don't. She looked at me, through me, almost, and then the look sharpened into something more deliberate, the way it did when she'd registered that my presence was an organizational problem. "Vivienne," she said. She said it the way she always said my name, like a word she was still deciding whether to keep. I smiled. She told her companions that I was Harrison's wife, and one of them asked what I did, the way women at these parties ask what you do as a way of determining whether the conversation is worth extending. I started to answer, and Constance cut smoothly across my response. "She does event work," she said. The same tone she'd used at every family dinner for 17 years, something vaguely part-time, something supplemental. Then she turned back to her companions and said something about the cocktails, and the three of them pivoted away together. And then, and this was the thing, this was the moment that had been accumulating for 17 years. She glanced back at me and said quietly but clearly that the cocktail hour was nearly finished and the staff would need to clear the room. And perhaps I'd be more comfortable with the catering team. Not a shout, not a scene, just that, delivered with the calm confidence of a woman who had never once in her life had reason to doubt that people would arrange themselves as she directed. The two women with her laughed. One of them looked mildly uncomfortable. The other didn't. I stood there for a moment. Just a moment. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because it was not what I expected. I had imagined this scenario, or variations of it, many times over the years. In those imaginings I felt rage, or the cold clarity of someone who has finally been given permission to act. But what I actually felt was something quieter and older than either of those things. It was the feeling of a door closing. Not slamming, just the soft, definitive click of something locking from the other side. 17 years, that was what closed. I looked at my mother-in-law. I looked at her two companions. I thought about Zoe in the back office right now, monitoring the event feeds. I thought about my AV coordinator who had the timeline on his tablet and was waiting for my signal to transition into the dinner program. I thought about the $40,000 floral contract that bore my company's name. Of course, I said. Pleasantly, completely neutral. And I walked away, not toward the catering team, toward the back of the room, where a door led to the operational corridor. Zoe was at the monitoring station when I came in. She took one look at my face and asked me what had happened. She knows me. We have worked together for 8 years. There is very little I can hide from her when something has shifted. I told her, concisely. She went still in the way she goes, still when she is very angry on behalf of someone she respects. She asked what I wanted to do. I looked at the monitors, 400 guests at round tables, my centerpieces, my lighting, my vendors, my timeline, a room that existed in its current form because of my company's months of labor. I know what I want to do, I said, but I need to think about how. The dinner program was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. There would be remarks from my father-in-law, a video tribute my team had produced from family photographs and testimonials collected over the previous 2 months, and then dancing. I had overseen every piece of it. I had watched the video in the editing suite and made notes on the music pacing. I knew every moment of the next 4 hours. What I did next was deliberate. I want to be clear about that. It was not a reaction, not a performance of wounded feelings, not a plea for sympathy. It was a decision made by someone who had finally decided that she was done organizing her life around other people's willingness to see her. I found my husband. He was at a table near the far wall, talking to one of his uncles. I went to him. I touched his arm, and he turned, and I told him, quietly, clearly and without any particular drama, exactly who my company was and what tonight had required of them. I watched his expression move through surprise into something more complicated, recognition perhaps of all the ways I had not shared my professional world with his family and what that meant about how I'd expected to be received. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Does my mother know?" "Not yet," I said. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he took my hand. "Whatever you decide to do," he said, "I'm with you." That was enough. I went to find our master of ceremonies, an MC we worked with regularly, a warm professional man named Gerald who had hosted dozens of our events. I asked him to add a brief introduction before the dinner program began. Just a minute or two. A few words from the event coordinator. He gave me a look that said he was filing this under things that happen at private events and told me to be ready in 15. I was ready. The room settled into its seats, the lights adjusted, warm and flattering, exactly as we'd spec them. Gerald took the stage and thanked everyone for a beautiful evening, offered some pleasantries about the occasion, and then said, "Before we begin our program for the evening, I'd like to invite the person responsible for making tonight possible to say a few words. 400 people in a ballroom can go very quiet." I walked to the stage. I didn't look at Constance immediately. I looked at the microphone, adjusted it the way I've adjusted hundreds of microphones, and let the room settle. "Good evening," I said. My voice was level. "For those of you I haven't met tonight, my name is Vivienne Ellison. I'm the founder and CEO of Ellison & Co. Event Management. We are the firm that designed and produced this evening." A pause. I used it the way you use a pause in events, intentionally. "I'm also," I said, "Harrison Callaway Marsh's wife. So I suppose you could say I have a personal investment in making sure tonight goes well." The silence lasted 2 full seconds. Then someone laughed. The right kind of laugh. Genuine, surprised. Then more people. And then a shift in the room, the particular shift that happens when a crowd recalibrates around new information. I looked at Constance then. She was sitting at the head table. My father-in-law was beside her, and his expression was one of open surprise that was already moving towards something that looked like delight. Constance's expression was not that. Constance's expression was the face of a woman who has just understood that she made a significant miscalculation. "My team has spent 7 months on this evening," I said, "and every one of them has been proud to work on it. I hope it shows." I looked at my father-in-law specifically now. He is not a bad man. He has never been cruel to me. He simply followed Constance's lead in the way that people in long marriages sometimes do, the way gravity moves you toward wherever the larger force is pulling. "Happy anniversary," I said, "to both of you. 40 years is something worth celebrating." I handed the microphone back to Gerald and walked off the stage. The room did not erupt. It wasn't that kind of moment. What happened instead was a murmur, the sound of several hundred people exchanging information simultaneously, and then the program began. Because the program was scheduled to begin and I had built it to run smoothly regardless of what happened around it. My father-in-law stood up and started moving toward me before Gerald had finished his transition remarks. He reached me near the edge of the room. He is a tall man, grey now, still physically imposing in the way of men who were athletic in their youth. He put his hands on my shoulders, both of them, a gesture he'd never used with me, and he looked at me in a way he'd never quite managed in 17 years. "Vivienne," he said. "My God, all this time? A lot of it?" I said. He shook his head. Not dismissively, more like someone trying to reorganize a long understanding that had just been shown to be wrong. He said, "I owe you an apology. I think we owe you more than one." I didn't tell him he was wrong, because he wasn't. My husband found me 10 minutes later. He was smiling in a way that looked a little like relief, which I understood, because he'd been managing the distance between me and his family for a long time, and something had shifted in a way that couldn't shift back. Whatever came next, the performance was over. He put his arm around me and we stood at the edge of the room together and watched 400 people enjoy an evening we had made. The food was exactly right. The music was exactly right. The tribute video, which my team had laboured over for weeks, made my father-in-law cry in front of his guests, which was the intended response and a sign that we had done our jobs. Constance did not come to find me that night. She waited 3 days. She came to our house on a Wednesday afternoon. I was working from home. I heard the bell and looked at the security camera and considered, briefly, not answering. Then I thought about what not answering would mean for the next 17 years, and I went to the door. She was dressed carefully, as she always was. She did not look diminished exactly, but she looked like a woman who had spent the previous 72 hours thinking about something in a way she was not accustomed to. She asked if she could come in. I said yes. I offered her coffee. She accepted. We sat at my kitchen table, which I had refinished myself 2 years ago on a weekend when Harrison was out of town. She looked around the kitchen, really looked at it, maybe for the first time, with the expression of someone seeing a space that contradicts their assumptions. "I don't know how to begin," she said. Then start somewhere, I said, not unkindly. She started with the wrong place, with the party, with what she hadn't known, with the awkwardness of the situation, and I let her go for a minute before I interrupted gently. I know you didn't know about the company, I said. That's not what I want to talk about. She stopped. I want to talk about what would have happened if you had known, I said. Would anything have been different? Would you have introduced me to your friends as someone who ran a business instead of someone who did event work? Would you have asked even once to hear about what I did? She was quiet for a long moment. Probably not, she said finally, and the honesty of it surprised me. I hadn't expected it. I've had a very fixed idea of who fits in this family, she said. What that looks like, I know that's not. She stopped, chose again. I know that's limited. It's limited, I agreed. She asked what she could do. I thought about it seriously. It deserved a serious answer. You could start by asking, I said, about my work, about what I've built. Not because you owe me admiration, but because I've been in your family for 17 years, and you don't actually know very much about me. That's something you could change. She nodded. Something in her face shifted. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to tell me the conversation had cost her something real. We sat there for another 40 minutes. It wasn't warm exactly, but it was honest in a way that our conversations had never been before. She asked about the company, how I'd started it, how large it was now, what kind of events we worked on. She asked the questions like someone who genuinely wanted the answers, and I answered them without performing modesty or fishing for approval. By the time she left, I didn't feel healed. I want to be clear about that. 17 years of being reduced by a person doesn't evaporate in a Wednesday afternoon kitchen conversation, but I felt something I hadn't felt in that relationship before, visible, not celebrated, not validated in the way I'd spent years low-key hoping for, just seen, actually looked at. That was enough to work with. My husband and I talked late into that night. Really talked, the kind of talking we hadn't done in a while about his family and my place in it, and what we both wanted going forward. Some of what he said surprised me. He'd been carrying more awareness of the dynamic than I'd realized and more guilt about it, and somewhere in the years of managing it, he'd also stopped believing it could change. Watching something shift, even slightly, had unlocked something in him too. We decided together what we wanted the next version of things to look like. Clearer limits, more honesty, less performance of harmony that didn't exist. It would be imperfect. Families usually are, but it would be more real. I'm telling you this story because I spent a long time being the woman who made herself manageable, small, easy to categorize and therefore easy to dismiss. I told myself it was strategic. I told myself I was protecting my energy for the things that mattered, and some of that was true, but some of it was fear. Fear that if I took up the space I'd earned, the people I wanted to love me would find a reason to love me less. Fear that claiming my own worth would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. The thing about standing on a stage in front of 400 people and telling the truth about who you are is that it strips the fear down to its actual size. What I discovered is that the thing I'd been afraid of losing, their approval, their regard, the version of inclusion that required me to stay invisible, was never really available to me in the first place. You cannot lose what you never had. What you can do is stop pretending you don't notice the absence. Stop organizing your life around a hole and call it fullness. The seat my mother-in-law told me to give up that night was a bar stool at a party I had built from the ground up. She thought she was dismissing me from something that belonged to her. She didn't know she was standing in something that belonged to me. I'm not particularly interested in what she thought. I'm interested in what she thought. I'm interested in what I know. I know who I am. I know what I've built. I know what it cost and what it's worth. I've known those things for years, but I was spending so much energy on the people who refused to see them that I'd started to misplace them myself. Not anymore. If you've been the person at the edge of the room, present but invisible, making yourself small for people who have never once offered to make room for you, I want you to hear this. The room doesn't always belong to the people who act like it does. Sometimes it belongs to someone who's been standing quietly near the service corridor, watching the whole thing run on her authority. Sometimes the table they're refusing to seat you at is one you already own. You don't have to announce it loudly. You don't have to make a scene or burn anything down. You just have to stop pretending you don't know your own name. I knew mine. It just took me a very long time to say it out loud. If this story found you today, wherever you are, if you know what it feels like to be catalogued as secondary by people who were supposed to see you clearly, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have your own story about claiming space that was already yours, I'd love to read it in the comments. None of us are building this alone. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that night in Westchester, not in any cosmic sense. I don't believe the universe was balancing some ledger on my behalf. What I believe is simpler and, I think, more honest. The way you treat people accumulates. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't get quietly filed away. It builds layer by layer into something that eventually has weight. Constance spent 17 years treating me like a footnote in her son's life. She wasn't dramatic about it. She didn't raise her voice or say anything she couldn't plausibly deny. She was refined about it, which almost made it worse, because refinement gave her choices. She chose in small, deliberate ways to make me invisible. And for 17 years, I let her. Not because I was weak. I want to be clear about that. I let her because I was busy building something, and I had decided early on that defending myself and that family was a fight that cost more than it returned. But here's what I've come to understand. The choice to stay quiet isn't neutral. Every time I didn't correct the record, I gave the fiction more room to grow. Every time I answered, fine, busy, good, and let the conversation move on, I was making a decision. I just wasn't making it consciously. I was operating on a kind of autopilot that felt like patience but was actually something closer to self-erasure. The moment Constance told me to go stand with the catering staff at a party my company had built from nothing over 7 months, something in me stopped functioning on autopilot, not from rage, from clarity. The kind of clarity you only get when the thing you'd been half hoping wasn't true finally proves itself beyond any reasonable doubt. What I did that night wasn't revenge. I need you to understand that. I didn't get on that stage to humiliate her. I got on that stage because I was finished organizing my life around her refusal to see me. Those are different things. One is about her, the other is about me. The aftermath unfolded the way things do when truth finally gets said out loud in a room full of people who'd been operating on a comfortable fiction. My father-in-law looked at me differently. Guests recalibrated. Constance sat with it for 3 days before she came to my kitchen and tried to find the beginning of a different conversation. None of that happened because I orchestrated it. It happened because I stopped pretending. That's the part I keep returning to. Not the dramatic moment on the stage, the 17 years before it, and the question of what I was spending my energy on. I was spending it on managing their perceptions, on making myself small enough to fit inside their frame without causing friction. And while I was doing that, I was also building a company, raising a reputation, doing work that mattered, but carrying the extra weight of a family that had decided I wasn't worth knowing. What I want to say to anyone who recognizes something of themselves in this story is, your silence isn't protecting you. I thought mine was. I thought I was choosing my battles wisely. But there's a difference between choosing not to fight and choosing to disappear, and I'd crossed that line without noticing. You don't have to make a speech, you don't have to wait for the perfect moment. You just have to stop agreeing, through your silence, that the version of you they've decided on is the one that's real. Vivienne Ellison runs an event management company. Vivienne Calloway Marsh had been invisible at family dinners for 17 years. Both of those women are me. The only thing that changed on that night in Westchester was that I stopped keeping them separate for other people's comfort. That was enough. That turned out to be everything.